No.
So, Frank, so you're in charge.
Okay, fine. So I wait 2 minutes now? Yes.
When you see that all panelists are here,
Okay.
and we have
We're missing Robert at the moment,
yeah,
yes. I
Robert,
think,
but
are we not?
he was present, so I hope he will join us in a moment. Yeah.
Okay, good. We will see. Still not here.
Yeah, I can write to him.
Please write to him. Yes, okay.
Hi, Frank.
Hello.
He's here.
Okay, good. Okay, we were waiting for you. Okay.
Sorry, I was just trying to grab some lunch.
Yes,
Half
but
an hour.
I didn't even get out for a coffee. Remember, but at least it's dawned in Toronto now, so that there's some
I've got my
light from the window. Yes. But very good. Okay, I would like to welcome you to our panel on the making of Cossack Ukraine, political thought, culture, and identity formation, 1569 to 1714, the monograph of Professor Zenon Kohut. We are fortunate today that in addition to our panelists, we have present with us Dr. Michaela Jacques, who is the acquisitions editor of McGill Queen's Press. The volume is published cooperatively with the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies Press, and I would like to ask her if she would say a few words about her press as well as acquisitions and of course our Ukrainian series. Dr. Jacques, please.
Thank you, Frank. I'll just take the opportunity to say thank you to everyone who's been involved with the organization of this panel, to CIUS Press, and most of all to Zenon Kohut. This book is the result of an ongoing collaboration between McGill Queen's University Press and the Canadian Institute for Ukrainian Studies Press. Some of you will undoubtedly be familiar with some of our other co-publications, such as 18th-Century Ukraine, which I know a lot of people here had a hand in, Serhiy Belenky's Laboratory of Modernity, and Tatiana Tayrova-Yakovleva's Ivan Mazepa and the Russian Empire. I know this particular publication has been a real labor of love for a long time, and everyone at MQP is proud to have had a hand in bringing it out. The making of Cossack Ukraine is an immense accomplishment at the press. We really do think it's a book that will prove to be a resource for scholars for years to come. And I'm very much looking forward to listening into your discussion today.
Thank you very much. So we have three speakers today to discuss the book. Regrettably, Zenon could not be with us. He is in fact in hospital at the moment. And the labor of love was mentioned. The book was written over quite a long period when Zenon faced many health challenges during that time. But it is, after all, the culmination of decades of his work in the field. And in that way, I think we are proud that it has both appeared and I understand as well is at least having initially a good series of sales and getting out to a wider public. We are, on the other hand, particularly interested that our colleagues in Ukraine, who may not have full access to libraries in the West, will be able to as well benefit from reading and evaluating the book. We will be looking into ways of doing this, of getting copies both of the hardcover, but also electronic access to more scholars in Ukraine and Poland. Although my hopes are that Poland has a little better funds for as well acquiring the book or access to libraries at the moment. Our first speaker will be Professor Robert Frost of the University of Aberdeen.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, excellent. I should say I feel like a bit of an interloper at an 18th century Ukraine conference. I'm just writing the last chapter of the second volume of my History of the Polish-Lithuanian Union, which Richard mentioned this morning. And that ends in 1648. So I'm currently writing about Władysław IV. So I'm very distant from the 18th century. I should say that I think the publication of Zenon's book is a marvelous moment because Zenon has done so much to chart the creation of a Cossack view of history in the 17th and 18th century, which is clearly of central importance to the history. How long have I got, Frank? About 10 minutes. Is that what you...
You may even take more since we have three speakers and Zenon is not with us.
Okay, right. Well, just tell me to shut up when you think I should shut up. I shall try to sort of 15 minutes or so. It's a classic. It will become a classic, I think. It tells us so much about the writing of history and about the way in which identity was formed after 1648. So what I thought I'd do is concentrate on the first chapter, because I will come to the 18th century eventually, but I haven't yet. and Richard talked about it this morning. There's certain points that I would take issue with. What is a general introduction? I realize that. But I think one of the interesting things about the Cossack version of Ukrainian history, as it becomes after 1648, and particularly in the 18th century, is that it's not the only version. Richard drew attention this morning to right bank Ukraine in the Commonwealth. And I'm particularly interested, I should say that volume 2 of my history is called The Making of the Polish-Lithuanian Republic. And I've deliberately chosen the term republic rather than the 17th century English version of Commonwealth, because I think that has all sorts of different connotations. And I use republic in the sense of a Renaissance republic, not a modern republic. A republic that has a king, a republic that's based on the polybian mixed form of government. Because I think that the appeal of that form of government to the nobility, the elites of the noble elites of 16th century Ukraine is a vital factor in the formation of Ukrainian identity. But they had a different version of history, of the history of Rus and of the history of Ukraine. And I just want to say a few things about politics and the law of that class, a class that Frank himself drew attention to many, many years ago, writing about the origins of the 1648 revolt and saying, look, we have to look not so much at the magnates, the great princely families, but at the ordinary nobility that Lipinski had looked at 100 years ago and said, and shown how they take part in this rebellion. So that's what I'm going to say a bit about today. Now, Zenon says at the start of his chapter that the Poland-Lithuania was a classic composite monarchy. It wasn't, I would say. It's a composite republic. And it's that republican element of self-government, which is right at the heart, as Quentin Skinner has pointed out, of the republican vision in the Renaissance, that is what appeals to not so much the princes. Zenon says it's the princes that bring through the change of 1569. Yes, Ostrogski and Sangushko and the princes are important in the final decision, but the movement comes from below. Ukrainian-based nobles from what is now Ukraine, the Ukrainian lands, were important in the move, the pressure that came from below in the Grand Duchy, from the middling wealthy szlachta, the szlachta hospodarska, the nobles who owned 2 or 3 villages, who were politically active. They wanted what they saw in Poland. And I would emphasize the importance of 1566 rather than 1569. That 1566 gives them the institutions of local self-government. The Sejmiks, the same. They fought with the Poles against Muscovy for 20 years. They've heard about the Polish system and they say, we want some of that. We are sick and fed up of the rule of the princes, of being told what to do by great wealthy families. And this ideal of noble Schlachter equality appeals to them greatly. So the second statute is vital. Now, 1569, I now talk not of the Union of Lublin, but the unions of Lublin. Because what happens in 1569 is the 3 Ukrainian palatinates make separate treaties of union with the Poles. They're invited to. This is not, at one point early on, Zenon says annexation. This is not an annexation. They have been smarting for some time under Lithuanian rule, where only Catholics can hold central office, and it's run by a cozy cartel of Radziwiłls and Chodkiewiczis and others. And so they see in this new structure that they gain from the Republic a way of reinventing sort of the rule of the Ukrainian lands for Ukrainians. Now, in 1569, the Poles do not want to take Kyiv Palatinate because they know that they will have to defend it against the Tatars, and Tatar raids are becoming more and more dangerous. But it's the Bratislavians and the Volhynians who insist, because what they see themselves as doing is reuniting Southern Rus. So the Palatinate, the Russkie Voyevodstvo, the Palatinate of Rus and Podolia, you know, those parts of the Ukrainian lands that had come under Polish rule in the 14th century. And I think, although Zenon draws attention quite rightly to the idea of the Republic of the Two Nations, I think if you read a lot of the literature between 1569 and 1648, Rus is in there very much. It's a problem, but this is a very fluid period of ideas. There are various attempts to reconcile the view of the past of the Ukrainian lands, of the Ruthenian lands, with the new republican system. And I think this is a very fertile period in Ukrainian intellectual history, because they're trying to work out how this all fits together and how this fits to the tradition of Kievan Rus. And I would say, I mean, I'm part of Tim Snyder's great Ukrainian History Global Initiative, and I've been given Lithuania as my subject. And I think what I want to do with that is to look at what 1569 means, because I don't think enough attention is paid to the consequences for the history of Rus, of the division of Rus in the Rump Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the post-1569 Grand Duchy, and the southern Ruthenian lands that become Ukraine. Because this is something that has to be brought in, and I think a lot more attention has to be devoted to links between Ruthenians across that division. And of course, religion is the most important. Let me say a little something about the social problems of, which Richard drew attention to, of these lands after the Union of Lublin, and particularly of the structure that Frank drew attention to, because there's many, many nobles, boyar class in these lands, whose status is unclear. And this is throughout the Grand Duchy. Those who would in Poland be regarded as nobles, who in terms of relationship to the means of production are no different from the dirt poor noble of Mazovia. They are nobles, or they see themselves as nobles, and they fight to defend the Ukrainian lands, which is very much in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, these lands, and in the Republic after 1569, the Ruthenian lands are the heartland of the defense of the Republic. This is the military class. The Wielkopolskans don't have to fight, so they don't like paying taxes. But the Ruthenian Sejmiks throughout the period from 1569 to 1648 say, we want to pay taxes because we need the money to defend our lands. And they complain about the Wielkopolskans. They also complain about the princes. And here I think there's so much study done of the princely families because it's easier to do because of the archives. But as was mentioned earlier on, Natalia Starchenko and others have been looking at this class through the court records. And that is vital. Because, as I said earlier, what is attractive about the Polish system is this idea of the equality of all nobles. And you can see this working out politically after 1569. I just, to mention one occasion, one of the great things about the coming of this new political system is an issue that comes up right from the start. The Poles are concerned about it, but the Ruthenians are as well, magnate retinues. So the magnates, the great families, turn up to the Sejm in Warsaw and turn up to Sejmiks with large retinues. Who's in these retinues? Well, partly it's their clients, members of the middling nobility, who just turn out because they're friends. But also it's what Witold Sienkiewicz called years ago, the Szlachta Zależna. Those nobles who do not have full independence, they rent their land or are granted their land on service contracts by great magnate houses. Now, the wealthy middle class, the middling nobility in Poland and in Ruthenia does not like these magnate retinues because they don't think that non-possessionati, those that do not own their own land, should really be part of this political system. So at every Sejm, you see them say, magnate retinues must be kept away. They must camp outside. They are not to come and take part in debates because they are servants of these great houses. So at the Lutsk Sejmik, the Volhynian Sejmik in 1593, Konstantin Vasil-Ostrovsky is annoyed because poor nobles, as he calls them, are shouting down his supporters. In the sort of application of force majeure that outraged ordinary nobles, he summoned his retinue to contain it. In the ensuing melee, one noble was killed, and there's a great protest lodged in the Lutsk castle court. This is why the middling Ukrainian Szlachta wants the union in 1569. So what about the identity? Now, I've just been reading accounts of the Sejm of 1632, the Convocation Sejm and the Election Sejm. Now, at the Convocation Sejm, the three Ukrainian Palatinates insist, they demand that all documents must be written to them in Ruski. This is 1632. That is a promise in the Articles of Union that they sign in 1569. But it doesn't happen. First of all, Warsaw after 1569, they can't find secretaries who know how to write Ruski. So rapidly Polish spreads. And of course, we emphasize the spread of the Polish language among the Ukrainian classes. But here in 1632, you've got Ruthenian, Ukrainian, Orthodox Szlachta turning up in Warsaw and saying, you must respect your own union treaties. And of course, Frank has pointed out that Kisiel points this out in the Sejm in 1642. And they say, if you do not settle the problem of the Orthodox Church, we will block proceedings. We know how to do this. The papal nuncio complains that the Sejmiks in the Ukrainian lands, that the Catholic nobles, of whom there are very many, just allow this to go through. They don't protest, which makes one wonder how much they want these privileges of these Palatinates that have been granted in 1569 to be respected, because they are still Ruthenian speaking as well as Polish speaking. So this is a really fluid period in which, you know, Starovolsky is writing very interesting things. His Sarmatian Warriors contains Volodymyr the Great, Grand Duke Vytautas, Konstantin Ostrowski, Konstantin Vasily Ostrowski, Mikhail Gliński, which is interesting, and Petro Konashevich Sahaydachny. And what I would like to end with was talking about how rapidly the Szlachta of these lands are integrated into this republican system right from the start, because I've developed a concept that I call Republican Catholicism. Everybody writes about Jesuits and the Counter-Reformation. But what the remarkable thing about the Constitutional Revolution, of which the Union of Lublin is the first phase, is how little religion matters. You have the Warsaw Confederation, which the bishops resist ever after. But when it's drawn up, the Sandomierz Sejmik insists that the Warsaw Confederation should explicitly cover the Orthodox as well as Protestants, that it shouldn't just be dissidentes, those who disagree in religion. It makes it clear that the Orthodox are covered. So one thing that Zenon admits, I think, in this chapter is that the Protestants and the Orthodox are working together very closely from the 1590s. They're holding common meetings. They are coordinating political activity to protect. I mean, religion is the big problem. And to an extent, this is pretty successful. The Archbishop of Gniezno, Wężyk, in 1632 states in the Sejm, we love dissidentes in religione. We love those who disagree with us on religion as brothers. And there is no reason for religious differences to diminish the good of the Republic. So this is a period when Sigismund has died, Władysław has not yet been elected, and Władysław chairs this commission trying to get an agreement between Uniates and Orthodox. Say, right, we both exist, we're both in the Ukrainian lands. How are we going to work out the problems that we have? And, you know, the Orthodox Church is never made illegal in the Ukrainian lands. It is just that Sigismund won't appoint bishops. And at the time of the Sandomierz Rokosz, he actually cultivates the Ruthenians. There is a law passed at the Sejm of 1609 that recognizes, in effect, that they still exist legally. And they fight for their church property through the local elected land courts. that had been set up after 1569. So in a way, what's happening in 1632 and what Władysław is trying to do is to regularize this. And what you get in 1569, when the Pacta Conventa are signed, they include the Warsaw Confederation, and 6 bishops sign it, 6 Roman Catholic bishops. So I would suggest that what you see in 1648 is something of a discontinuity. Thereafter, one version of the Ruthenian past, and I could say stuff about the writing of various histories up to 1648, in Poland as well as in Ukraine, that take seriously the Ruthenian past, that thereafter, what happens after 1648 is in many levels a civil war of the Ruthenian peoples of Ukraine. And yes, there's part of it is Poles against Ukrainians, but it's also Ukrainians against Catholic Ukrainians, Uniate Ukrainians, Ukrainians that remain loyal to the Republican ideal, that the Cossacks actually want to be included in. We are nobles too, they are saying. The only way you can get nobility and noble through the same is through military service. Well, they think they've done that. They've proven themselves at Khotyn in 1621 and against Muscovy in 1632 to 34. We deserve to be recognized as what we are, true nobles. And it is, I think the 1640s show that it's actually the princely families of Ukraine, most of them now Catholic, who are as much to deal, they do not want this class to become recognized as noble. And I will end, if I can find it, with a quote from Jerzy Zbaraski, a famous quote from Zbaraski, who hates the Jesuits. He's Catholic. The second of 2 Ruthenian magnates who become Castellan of Krakow, which doesn't actually please the Krakowian Schlachter at first, but that's another matter. He writes in 1619 to a Jesuit, "You have written much to me of your religious work in Ukraine. I prefer a dispassionate religion that endures to a fervent religion that sets all ablaze. You may continue your great religious endeavor elsewhere. I do not want it in my home, for I would prefer to close churches and refuse to harbor priests there than to allow injustice to occur. Poland is neither Rome nor Spain. I do not fear the Inquisition." He is a tolerant Republican Catholic. He has no time for Jesuits. He has no time. He recognizes that religion is the danger to the Republic if you do not accept toleration, like the Ostrogski. But of course, the Zbaraski brothers have no wives, no children. Ostrogski dies, and the weight of gravity in Ukraine moves to the Catholicized families like the Vishnyevetski and so on. And that is a problem. But I will end there because I think I've probably gone on too long. But I just wanted to raise the idea that there are alternative versions of the history of Rus within the Republic by people in the Ukrainian lands that survived right through the Right Bank period. And that modern Ukrainian identity is, I think, owes much to these ideas. You know, Antonovich in the 19th century, he's a descendant of these families. And in the 19th century, well, the 19th century is a different territory, so I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Now I'd like to ask Professor Teresa Hinchevska-Hendel of the University of Warsaw to give us comment. Teresa?
Good afternoon.
Okay, good.
Okay. First and foremost, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all participants in this meeting. I welcome and greet my colleagues from Ukraine who, despite the cruel war against the Muscovite invaders, are working bravely. Some are defending their homeland directly at the front. Professor Zenon Kohut's book is of extraordinary importance. It reveals to the English-speaking world, not just the academic world, the historical truth about events from centuries ago about Ukraine from the time of the Union of Lublin to 1714. Over these 150 years, the author has shown the evolution and, as he himself wrote, the reconstruction of Ukrainian thought encompassed a myriad of concepts, projects, and identities. What clearly binds this mosaic together from the times of Khmelnytsky and the Hetmanate through Piotr Doroshenko, Ivan Samoilovich, to Mazepa and Orlik is the will to create an independent, free, and modern Ukrainian state in that era. The best evidence of this idea of liberating Ukraine from the Moscow yoke, as Natalia Yakovenko asserts, was the Pacta et Constitutiones Legum Libertatumque Exercitus Zaporoviensis, adopted on the day of Philip Orlik's election as hetman. This constitution, I'm not discussing here whether it was the first modern constitution in Europe, specified everything that defined the state. That is, borders, territory, the concept of nation, finances, judiciary, and religion. This document also mentions a good state system which should correspond to a free nation. The final part of the constitution contains the hetman's oath, which obliges him to be devoted and faithful to our fatherland until the end, and to zealously care for the common good and unity of Mother, Little Russia, Mała Rosja. At this point, a problem arises, well illustrated in the book by Zenon Kochut, the issue of nomenclature, various terms, and their meanings in the old era. We are dealing here with not one, but at least two serious problems. The first is the regrettable manipulation of language, ruthlessly employed over the long term by various branches of Moscow, Soviet, and Russian propaganda. This issue has been raised for many years by distinguished researchers, not least of which of Giovanna Brodzi-Berkow, an Italian Slavic scholar, who in her speech at the 2003 Slavic Congress discussed the significance of terms such as Ruthenia, Ukraine, Rus, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Moscow, Russia, etc., in the context of literature. Eva Thompson did a similar thing in her compelling book Imperial Knowledge. It's also worth mentioning Mykola Rabchuk, whom Professor Kochut values and cites, and his book From the Little Russia to Ukraine. It must also be stated, which a problem is problem of truism, that linguistic manipulation facilitates the manipulation of historical truth. Attempts to identify Muscovy and Russia with Kievan Rus would require a separate discussion. Here I would only mention the work of Edward Kennan and his book on Russian historical myths. The second issue involves the interpretation of names, words, and terms such as Ruthenia, Ukraine, Russia, Moscovia, and Little Russia. The latter appears in Orlik's work in his book. Zenon Kochut, with great caution, yet convincingly presents the meaning of these important concepts and their historical context. Let us add other words here: nation, society, state nation versus Cossack, or noble nation, fatherland, of our common fatherland, the Polish, during the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth before the Khmelnytsky uprising, and others. Perhaps the first question that arises here is the validity of addressing the subject of identity or national consciousness before the industrial era. In essence, the dilemma remains unresolved. Some researchers believe that the study of post-Enlightenment nations and societies scientifically meaningful, while others argue that nations without an elite would be incapable of existence. And therefore, their identity of national consciousness are of the utmost importance and cannot be overestimated. Professor Kochut is, of course, a proponent of this particular research path. He likes and appreciates it, as I believe many scholars do, the Czech historian Miroslav Kroch and his research on the small nations of Europe. I, however, would like to mention my first mentor, Professor Benedikt Ziętara, author of the book Świt Narodów Europejskich, The Dawn of European Nations, the Formation of National Consciousness in Post-Carolingian Europe. Here are his words from the foreword to the book cited here. I have tried to demonstrate that the development of national consciousness, now rather replaced, I see, by the term national identity, did not constitute a continuous extending line and did not grow steadily from its first beginnings to its full flowering in the 19th or 20th century. It is impossible to utilize the many interesting themes contained in Professor Zenon Kochut's book, The Making of Cossack Ukraine, in a short discussion. However, I would like to point out, continuing Professor Ziętara's thought, that the persistence of the phenomenon in the Brodelian sense, this is the famous historian Brodel, of the persistence of national identity formation is an extremely fascinating topic. Zenon Kochut ends his book in 1714. This is a perfectly logical conclusion. The alliance with Charles XII, the Crimean Khan Devlet-Geray, the attempt to involve Leszczyński's supporters and Turkey, and the 1718 battles for Ukraine with Peter I, despite Russia's initial capitulation and the signing of the Treaty of Prut near Jassy. Moscow temporarily renounced its claims to Ukraine, did not end favorably for Ukraine. Further developments are unfavorably for it. In June 1712, the 25-year Treaty of Adrianople was concluded. On the right bank, Ukraine was recognized as Cossack land. Left bank, Ukraine and Kiev remained under Russian jurisdiction. Turkey, the guarantor of this peace, pursued his interests in the Balkans, and, as Natalia Yakovenko put, effectively sold Orlik's state to Poland. I'm thinking about Daniel Horenko's battles with the Poles. Orlik's subsequent fate was that of an emigrant. Valuable for researchers his extensive travel diary from 1702 to 1732, located in the Archives Diplomatiques du Ministère des Affaires étrangères in Paris, contains 3,000 pages of notes. Orlik sought support from European courts for Ukraine, for the liberation, as he wrote, of our unfortunate homeland from the harsh and tyrannical Muscovite subjugation. He wrote letters to many prominent figures in Europe, trying to convince them that the strengthening of Peter I threatened Europe with danger. He was aided diplomatically by his beloved son Grzegorz, a diplomat, general, and friend of Voltaire. The team, under the supervision of Professor Valentyna Sobol, consisting of her student David Bzorek, Professor Mirosław Nagielski, and myself, have been working together for over a year on an addition to Oleg's diaries under a grant from the Polish Ministry of Education and Higher Education. I hope that in a few years, we will be able to realize our editorial plans. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate the importance of Professor Zenon Kohut's book, Historical Truth should always overcome the Russian narrative, which for centuries has served only to legitimize the reconstruction of the empire and regrettable ambitions of domination over Ukraine and Eastern Europe, if not all Europe. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to ask our third speaker, Dr. Andriy Bovhiria of the Institute of History of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, to comment on the book.
Yeah, thank you very much, Frank, and thank you very much, colleague, for organizing this roundtable discussion about the book of Professor Zenon Kohut. So, firstly, I would like to say that this is a book that many of us have been waiting for, and it brings together years and I would say decades of the author's work. And also it's important to state that Zenon Kohut completed this book despite being seriously ill. And for us, this is not an intellectual synthesis, but also a deeply personal act of responsibility towards the subject and our scholarly community. So let me turn to the book itself and briefly share my impression. And this topic is, of course, very close to my own work. And unfortunately, I have not had the chance to read this book entirely. But even from what I have read and from its overall structure and argument, a few things seem especially clear. So the book explores how a distinct Ukrainian political culture emerged between the late 16th century and 1714. It consistently presents early modern Ukraine as a distinct stage in the development of political thought. The book's starting point is Gabriel Almond's classic definition of political culture, which encompasses not only institution, not only formal doctrines, but also the complex of assumption, habits, values, rhetorical formulas, and ways of thinking. And it's precisely this subsurface level that the book explores. So in my view, the strongest conceptual result of the book is the formulation of two major narratives about Cossack Ukraine, which were already fully formed by 1714. It's about the Slavono-Russian narrative, articulated in the synopses and related texts, where Kyiv, where Kievan cave monastery is presented, appear as source, foundation, and expression of the Slavono-Russian people and Orthodox Tsardom. In contrast, to this narrative stands Orlik's grand narrative with its Cossack Ruthenian free nation, with its own antiquity, with its own rights and liberties, without any natural or dynastic bond with the Muscovites and Muscovite Tsar. Most studies have used either this synopsis or Orlik mainly as a quotation, as a convenient illustrations of an already assumed imperial or Cossack national line. But in this book, by contrast, they are taken seriously as a two coherent and competing narratives in their own rights. And between these two narratives lies another one major narratives, what the author calls the Mazepian synthesis. And this Mazepian synthesis, according to author's observation, is a coherent state project in which we have the state of the Zaporozhian host and Ruthenian people. We have continuity with Kievan Rus past. We have sacralized Kyiv as a new Jerusalem. We have Hetman as a father of fatherland. And all of these concepts were based on the loyalty to the Muscovite Tsar and shared Orthodox mission against infidels. And the key conclusion is that while this synthesis reinforced the legitimacy of Mazepa state project, it also muted the older Cossack narrative of a free nation with its perpetual rights. When Northern War and Peter's the first policy makes such loyalty impossible, the Mazepian synthesis collapses and the contractual models returns. It then receives its, I would say, radical formulation in Orlik narratives. And this is a transition from one grand scheme to another, from one grand narrative to another. And the book, this book traces it very clearly. Alongside these three major narratives, Professor Kogut also gives an important place to the Cossack chronicles. So he doesn't treat them as a separate fourth grand narrative, but as a place where these projects are worked through in story form. So, for example, the Eyewitness Chronicle shows a very consistent Cossack Ukrainian patriotism from within, without big theoretical concept, but with a clearer sense of our Ukraine. And later, such chronicles as Hrabyanka and Velichko take key elements of this Mazepian synthesis and the contractual idea of perpetual rights and liberties, and turns them into a continuous history of Cossack Ukraine. In other words, the chronicles are where these ideas become full written narrative about the past. And another strand of this book, which has been already mentioned by Professor Teresa Hinchevska-Henel, it's about dealing with terminology. So the author is not satisfied with merely noting that sources use terms such as Russia, Mala Russia, or Ukraina. He demonstrates very clearly how, for example, the term Ruthenian nation initially refers to the nobility of couple Palatinates, and how, in the context of confessional crisis, the Cossacks and townspeople became part of this narrative. how Mala Rus moves from ecclesiastical usage into the political sphere, becoming a label for the hetmanate both in Muscovite state discourse and also for Cossack hetmanate as a self-description, as a self-definition. So in my view, the making of Cossack Ukraine encourages us to take Cossack Ukraine much more seriously, rather than viewing it as just a preparation for 19th century. We should recognize it as a complex political culture with its own grand narratives. And to finish, I just wanted to say that for me, this book is not only about the 17th and 18th century. It also helps to explain why so many arguments about Ukraine still sounds familiar today. And I would like to thank Professor Kohut. I hope he will be watching this record. I would like to thank him for this book and to wish him health, as well as wish him many attentive readers, thoughtful discussion, and grateful students, scholars who will research, who will carry this question further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are, of course, at the disadvantage. We had hoped that Zenon would be able to take part in this. He is not able because of his health at the moment. Now, as many of you know, he and I have been in conversation for about 60 years now. And I, unlike most of you present, have read this book, and more than once. So I think I will add a few more comments on it before we open it up for general discussion and what I find interesting in it. As I think all of you know, Zenon began his career by writing a monograph on the incorporation of the Ukrainian Hetmanate into the Russian Empire and that absorption. It was at its time a unique book, both within Ukrainian historical studies and in understandings of the Russian Empire. As he and I worked on our respective fields, I always said, well, it's somewhat like our characters. You chose the period of decline, and I chose the period of beginning. I get to the Khmelnytsky Revolt of 1648 and the formation of Cossack Ukraine. I think this somewhat affects our discussion, Robert Frost's discussion at the beginning. I am grateful that I indicated a number of things he finds useful now, but there is a certain divergence in vision because I turn more and more to the Ukrainian territories as the place the Commonwealth failed. Now, what I think Zenon did in going back to the 16th century and taking the story down to 1714 is he reworked our periodization. And I think periodization is extremely important for how we conceive, how things begin and end. All did not begin with Khmelnytsky entering Kyiv as Moses liberated of his people from the Polish servitude. All did not begin with the concept of Ukraine on both banks of the Dnieper, crucial for all subsequent Ukrainian political thought. But I think he was reaching back, and as I think Robert quite rightly said, there are various, I'm not sure narratives, there are various events that occur at this time, and the story of how the Cossack identity, myth, conceptualization of Ukraine wins out, I would say, does leave out other elements of the story. Although in many ways, I would argue, the old Ruthenian nobility prepared the way, not consciously for the Cossacks, but all their complaints at the Semiki then are picked up by the Cossacks and used in new ways. So, of course, it's essential to the story. But I think even more important, I think, as Professor Inchevska-Handel has brought out, is the terminal point. That is, by placing it in 1714, everything looks quite different. Our tendency, particularly those who followed what might be called the synopsis and Little Rossian vision, end in a certain way in Peter's time, but are aiming at the vision which brings the Muscovite Tsar into this story and not rejects it. We have attended, on the other hand, to treat the exiles, the group that Oris Subtelny long ago wrote about when you could not do it in Ukraine, as somehow an anomaly. After all, they don't win. They wind up in emigration. And the word constitution, which we use, we know the controversies on this, have, I think, in some ways blocked out our vision of their reconceptualization of Ukraine, of the Cossack Ukraine, and of the Khazar origins of the Cossacks that Professor Bohiria has worked on and others have worked on. That is, that found an entirely different vision of how to relate Rus and Cossacks. And in this, they are intellectually extremely interesting. And then I would say, for those of you who have not had the book yet, it is primarily what the title says. It is deals with culture, identity, and a formation of certain visions of the past through the intensive study of a number of these texts. And here I think that Zenin has as well been innovative in his interpretation, in his careful reading of the synopsis. In most cases, the synopsis is mentioned and not read because it's not easy to make sense of it. Zenin has worked long on this. It is not a preliminary work of a triune East Slavic people. It deals more with relationship to a ruler and a certain kind of history of the past. I think he's done a remarkable work with that as well. What is, I think, as well, for those of you who have not looked at it, he has also used the newer fragments that we have found in the Dvoretsky and other manuscripts that have been paid little attention to as they were discovered rather late, and he puts this into it. What I find stunning in the work is, as in all of his work for many years, he's always extremely thorough and careful in these presentations, never to make a supposition or assumption or to take his text too far as he goes. And at sometimes that creates a story that is not so unilinear. And he is willing to allow that to happen in this book. And I think in that way it is extremely important. Now, what I hope in the long run is it will be important for not only historians of Ukraine, but for both sets of their colleagues. Regrettably, we are cut off from most of our Russian colleagues, or at least specialists in Russian history in the West. I have great hopes that they will pick up this and have the Sitzfleisch to get through this book, because it deals largely with topics that they have, I think, dealt with rather perfunctorily in their visions of how 17th and early 18th century Russia operated. And I think this will be very useful. But I think it will be as useful for Polish historians. I think what we have seen today, and I hope to bring out in some comments tomorrow, I hope will be useful. I don't want to use all of my material ahead of time, but what I would say is there is a 17th century narrative that forms in which Poland and the Commonwealth are very important, but they are not the main line of discussion. There is no other narrative that comes from the right bank after 1648 that develops well. We can talk about Hadyach and other things, but there's not a long-term, and there's certainly not the textual parts of it. And what I have always, and I will once again make my case tomorrow, but I know it's something Zenon would agree with. Too many historians of Poland are prisoners of the 1772 borders. They do not look at where those territories that do not fit within the narrative of the Commonwealth, as much of left bank Ukraine was, or see a zone. Perhaps we overestimate borders at times, and that's what I'll be trying to argue tomorrow. And that's another thing I think you can find in this book. That is, of course, by the time you get to Orlik, obviously Lithuania and Poland and Bohemia are central topics of this story. And yet they fit into a Cossack Ukraine, Ukraine on both sides of the Dnieper. And that is the Ukraine that I think is often lacking in traditional Polish narratives. It's something that Drahomanov later tried to point out to his Polish colleagues, but I don't think at that point they were open to it. So it is a careful source study from the many years he worked on these various topics. I think that Dr. Bohiria has quite correctly emphasized what I think is a major innovation, which is both his Mazepian synthesis and then Orlik, and put them in tandem. And with that, after talking too long on this, I think we can say that if we do have time for discussion of this period. For those of you who have not had the opportunity, which I assume is most of our audience, for reading the book, we still welcome general comments on these period and the topics that you have overcome. So I will use the words of Ivan Lesiak Ruditsky, who once said at the Harvard seminar, "Although I have not had the pleasure of hearing your lecture, I think." So you are free then to join in that broader context for our discussion now. And do any of the speakers, would they like to in any way respond or expand? You are also welcome back to this discussion at this point from anything you've heard from your colleagues. Okay, Svitlana Potapenko, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to see you. And first of all, I'm thankful for the insightful visions which you shared with us. Actually, I belong to that lucky minority who has already this book, but at the same time, I'm a representative of that majority who still anticipates reading it. So in my short comment, just a comment, I want just to to support the idea shared by Andriy that actually what we need is to properly evaluate the period of Cossack Ukraine is as not just something in between of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. I mean that classic maybe version of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth before the Khmelnytsky uprising, and the period of the 19th century, the period of the flourishing of the nation-building projects, but as something which really needs to be evaluated, to be reconsidered, to be explored, and to be, let's say, probably incorporated as much in the Ukrainian historiography as in the Polish historiography, as Frank has already said, but generally, even in a broader context. So my view is just to support these ideas and to say maybe again that we are happy that we have this great opportunity to incorporate this book, this new contribution, to broader context at the present stage of the historiography of development. So thank you, and yeah, great. This book has been published.
Great, thank you. Okay, I await. Is there anyone else? Yes, Volodymyr Sklokin, please. You unmute.
Sorry. So thank you, colleagues, thank you, all commentators, and the biggest thanks goes to Zenon Kogut, who is unfortunately not with us. So I had the pleasure to read this book already, and I could say that for me it was very stimulating and fascinating reading. And in my view, it should be a major English language synthesis of early modern Ukrainian political thought and also political history. What is, I think, the advantage of this book that it successfully combines the breadth of coverage with a clear argument about the emergence and transformation of early modern Ruthenian or Ukrainian patriotism and political culture from the late 16th century to the early 18th century with these ideas about Mazepian synthesis and Orlov's grand narrative of Cossack history. And on the whole, I think this argument and the coverage provided by Zenon Kogut is very convincing and very stimulating, yeah? But in order not just to somehow to praise, yeah, but also to stimulate the discussion, I would like to ask colleagues, our commentators who have read the book already, so what do they think about the main argument of this book, about this Mazepian synthesis of Slaviano-Russian historical narrative and identity narrative and Orlov's narrative of Cossack nation, which Andriy Bavgiria has described. So, and what was of interest for me is that in the book, Zenon provides not only the examination of this narrative of political thought, political formation of political identity, but he also provides a narrative of political history for this period and also for the Mazepian period as a kind of culmination, the major kind of turning point both in the history of political thought and in political history. And my question is, so can we agree with Zenon Kogut that this Mazepian synthesis of political culture and political identity was complemented with conscious reform program in the Hetmanate, yeah? And can we agree that with Zenon that Mazepa was an enlightened and benevolent ruler who had conscious intentions to build kind of autonomous and well-ordered state or polity, as Zenon frames it? Yeah, so actually, was it only about narratives and identities, or it was also about some conscious program of state building and modernization? Yes, so I think, so Zenon points is that there was such conscious program, but I'm curious, what do you think? Does he provide convincing arguments for this?
Would any of our commentators like to take up this question? So at the moment, we have relative silence.
Maybe this is a question to Zenon, yeah.
I hope, okay, and of course, what I've thought as I've looked over our program, and particularly when I'm going to give my rather banal research agendas and ideas tomorrow, is that many of the panels that deal at this conference do deal with this. Obviously, the Mazepin issue and the concept of Mazepa as a political ruler has been battled for, well, centuries, we'll say now, and certainly for decades. I remember well when Professor James Craycraft wanted to deal with the Vladimir play, and it was so difficult to convince him that Professor George Chevalov was pointing in the right direction when he was pointing that this was about Mazepa. It was impossible for a historian of Russia of that generation, particularly trained at Oxford and such places, to conceive that Prokopovich could, within a few years, just redo whom the object of it was. But the other side, of course, is the great problem of the secretiveness of Mazepa. We've gotten works. I don't think Tatiana Tairova is with us today, but we have Tatiana who has worked with new materials on Mazepa. But we will always be, I think, the prisoners of the secretiveness of Mazepa and the lack of those political texts. So one then winds up falling back on what Mazepa did. And it seems to me the considerable possibility. Zenon as well, for those of you who haven't seen the book, also works with images and material in trying to discuss this Mazepin synthesis. I think it is some of an interesting part of the book. I know he thanks Lydia Berezhnaya for her contribution to it. I'm looking to see if she's here, since she's someone who dealt with those sections, I think, carefully on it. So if anyone else would like to dive in that I've stretched my opinion out, please do.
But I don't feel terribly sort of ready to talk much about Mazepa, because it's years since I've looked at him. As I said, I've been back in the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries. But it strikes me he does more than a synthesis, that he produces something new. And I say that just on the basis of having been to Chernihiv and looked at the architecture of the Cossack Baroque that he created there, which is magnificent, but it's also taking something beyond. It is producing something that is unique, I think. I've never seen anything like it. And I think he's a very interesting character indeed. And that sort of sense of drawing together the various strands of Ukrainian history. And this is a man, after all, who began his career as a page at the Polish court. So he's been open to a whole range of influences. And I think that's evident in what he seeks to do. He cannot be constrained much longer by Muscovite autocracy. He's seen too much of the world. He's seen too much of alternatives. So I agree that Mazepa is a fascinating character, and I will bow to Zenon on him.
And I think, if I may, we have with us our president, Yuri Voloshin, who has already published a review of this book recently. Може, пане Юрію, ви хочете кілька слів сказати?
І, очевидно, то може бути або по-українськи, або по-польську, так, як chcecie, так.
Ну, я думаю, що для української історіографії книжка Зенона Когута нова, ту, яку ми обговорюємо тут, це певною мірою знакова книжка. В першу чергу, мені видається, що якби ми підійшли до того моменту, коли власне настав час обговорити саме політичні ідеї, знаєте. Якось тривалий час українські історики писали про битви, якісь там компроміси, альянси. А тут повністю такою червоною ниткою через цю книжку проходить саме формування цієї козацької ідеї, яка, як для мене, історика 18 століття, коли я ну, в джерелах вона постійно, козацький наратив, про який Андрій говорив, він постійно виходить, да, в цих всяких текстах, які виходять від козаків, в їхніх дискусіях із Москвою, в їхніх самопрезентаціях різноманітних. І мені видається, що це дуже добрий аналіз і дуже добре пояснення. Це те, чого певною мірою не вистачало. Мені видається, що дуже тонко підмічено, як формувався цей козацький наратив і як він перемінявся час від часу. Да? Тобто від гетьмана до гетьмана іде заміна, ну, допрацьовується і певною мірою, ну, навіть якщо взяти Мазепу і Орлика, то там взагалі міняється, ну, не кардинально, але досить суттєво, так. І як навіть ідеї Орлика, які написані на правобережжі, потім приймаються Гетьманщиною, да, і Величком, і Грабянкою, і ці ідеї, які потім Дівович висловлює в претензіях до Московії, і ці ідеї, які потім впливають на формування власне модерної нації. Це дуже суттєво, які через історію Русів проходять. Мені видається, що це, ну, така точка зору на цей процес, вона дуже цінна. Насправді, і, ну, не знаю, тут можна дискутувати, можна обговорити, але мені імпонує те, що Зенон бачить навіть дальшу перспективу, да? Формування цих двох наративів, один на основі синопсису, який потім і не тільки наратив, а ще, знаєте, ці позиції духовенства і козацтва, як вони розходяться в подальшому. Да? Київські книжники, по суті, формують наратив для Великої Росії. На те, що Київ, Київська Русь, Московська Русь і так далі, а козацькі інтелектуали, вони формують наратив подалі для формування модерної української нації. Ці мені видається, ці зауваження, вони дуже суттєві, і ну, Когут каже, що власне і сучасна війна, вона значною мірою спровокована битвою цих наративів двох, які між собою, ну, не поєднуються. Тому мені видається, що, на мою думку, глибоке переконання, це дуже важлива для нас книжка, про неї можна говорити, можна щось там може не приймати, але, ну, я черговий раз вражений цим дуже добрим аналізом тексту і, власне, ну і ще один момент, про який сьогодні в нас дуже багато говориться в українській історіографії, це історіографії, навіть воно виходить за межі, да, про те вплив, власне, культури Речі Посполитої. Да, і оця те, що сьогодні, ну, якби в Україні, там не тільки в історіографії, там в шкільній історії, да, розглядається проблема, що Річ Посполита наша, да, і, ну, Наталя Сарченко це, і Віталій Михайловський про це говорять, да, про те, що річ, ну, тобто це теж частина нашої культури, нашої історії, і що це не якісь там, знаєте, ці радянські тези про польсько-шляхетське панування і так далі. І тут якраз Зенон показує, як от ці ідеї зароджуються, як вони проходять, як козацтво включається в цю руську націю, як воно стає її презентувати починає. І це дуже мені видається важливо саме, ну, в сучасність, да? Тому що власне ця культура, яка, ну тобто, я думаю, що це книжка знакова. Я там вписав тому, що Зенон Когут, ну, перша його книжка мала велике значення, да, в свій час в 90-х. Ну, вона на нас тоді велике враження справила. Ми тоді ще тільки теж відходили від цих радянських стандартів і писання історії. Ну, і ця так само сильна і дуже знакова. Я вважаю, що це Ну, її треба українською перекласти як можна швидше, але взагалі прекрасно, що вона вийшла англійською, через те, що вона, ну, мені здається, показує світу, от як це, звідки це все взялося і наскільки це, ну, важливо. Дякую.
Dякую. Yes, Professor Zwerszykowski, please.
Ja pozwolę sobie mówić po polsku.
Proszę
Chciałem
bardzo,
bardzo
tak.
serdecznie podziękować i bardzo się cieszę, że dołączyłem do dzisiejszego panelu. Wysłuchałem bardzo interesujących prezentacji książki, którą mogę zadeklarować, że z chęcią niebawem postaram się przeczytać, bo bardzo mnie zaintrygowała. I szczególnie to, co podkreślał pan profesor Sysyn, że te ramy chronologiczne tak poszerzone tej książki, tego punktu widzenia, pozwalają ująć bardzo szerokie pole dyskusji. Ja myślę, że ten punkt widzenia ułatwi włączenie tego obrazu do historiografii polskiej i spoglądanie na te koncepcje, o których książka mówi, jako na coś, co jest częścią historii Rzeczypospolitej, jako reakcja na kryzys, głęboki kryzys tego, co mówił profesor Chrost, czyli republiki. Czyli rzeczywiście ja bym się przychylał do tego pojęcia, że to miał być ten projekt Rzeczypospolitej, który do pierwszej połowy XVII wieku jeszcze sprawiał wrażenie, że da się go zrealizować, natomiast z każdym dziesięcioleciem kolejnym okazywało się, że Rzeczpospolita nie jest w stanie zrealizować tego ideału, do którego wielu dążyło. I teraz poszukiwano różnych dróg wyjścia z tego problemu i ta droga ukraińska traktowana w ten sposób jest tym sposobem innym na szukanie drogi wyjścia z potężnego kryzysu tego pomysłu, konceptu Rzeczypospolitej. To jest podwójnie dla mnie interesujące. Wczoraj brałem udział w obronie doktoratu jednego z wybitnych historyków Rzeczypospolitej dawnej, ja lubię to określenie stosować, Andrzeja Radamana, który od wczoraj jest doktorem. I dużo czytałem, bo byłem jednym z recenzentów tej rozprawy, dużo czytałem o tym podejściu wielkoksiążęcym, litewskim do budowania Rzeczypospolitej, bo on zajmował się pierwszym okresem przełomu XVI i XVII wieku. Jak potężny wkład intelektualny tej szlachty litewskiej w budowanie Rzeczypospolitej, nie tylko Wielkiego Księstwa, ale całego systemu Rzeczypospolitej. To, o czym mówiłem w swoim wystąpieniu, czyli te przemyślenia Gierowskiego, młodego z początku kariery, o tym, że ta aktywność szlachty ruskiej z kolei w budowaniu Rzeczypospolitej, ja sam tego doświadczyłem w województwie bełskim, czytając uchwały szlachty bełskiej z czasu właśnie końca XVI wieku, początku XVIII wieku, jak duży wkład intelektualny w budowanie różnych rozwiązań ustrojowych. I to wszystko zawaliło się w momencie, kiedy się okazało, że tych projektów się realizować nie da. No i teraz myślę, że książka profesora Kochuta w tak dużych ramach chronologicznych, czyli od Unii Lubelskiej aż do tej koncepcji Orlika, myślę, że bardzo mocno ułatwi historykom polskim również przemyślenie tych procesów, które zachodziły na ziemiach ukrainnych i włączenie tego w ten dyskurs polski, ale na takiej zasadzie właśnie po prostu, że to jest jedna z kolejnych dróg, w jaki sposób szukano wyjścia z tej sytuacji, że Rzeczpospolita nie spełniła swoich tych oczekiwań, tak? Czyli ten projekt republiki w tej części Europy okazał się nierealny, nierealistyczny. No, wydaje się, że to inna droga w tej części Europy nie była możliwa. W związku z tym bardzo dziękuję i deklaruję, że tę książkę na pewno przeczytam z wielkim zainteresowaniem.
Dziękuję bardzo. And I think we can also add to this the fear that they had that a Rzeczpospolita Kozacka would be formed. So we already have by the 1620s, Rzeczpospolita Kozacka was at that point, we get not from the Cossack sources, but from the Szlachta of these lands, and saw this as a potential concurrent of theirs. Robert?
Yeah, I would just say that I don't quite agree. I mean, I do not think that 1648 was inevitable. It was inevitable. I think it became increasingly likely during the 1640s, but I don't think this was an experiment that was bound to fail. I think it was a great vision, an ideal that appealed please pass on my congratulations to Dr. Radaman, because I think he has done some outstanding work on Lithuania, that the Lithuanians and the Ruthenians added a great deal to what the Poles had. I mean, in the period between 1569 and 1648, by far the most dynamic part of the Commonwealth was the Ukrainian lands. They were developing rapidly, economically. The foundation of all the new towns that, you know, these private cities that have been investigated. This was where the Commonwealth, the Republic, was developing, and it was a victim of its own problem. And I would agree with Frank. I mean, I think not necessarily just the Cossacks, but the Ruthenians, Kyiv and others, they're the conscience of the Republic. They are saying, look, you are throwing something away here. You are not respecting your own laws and your own constitutions. And that's what the Schlachter from Volhynia are saying in 1632. Look, you told us that you would write to us in Ruthenian. You haven't. Please resume, as you said you would. And I think that the Republic could have got through the 1640s and survived. I mean, from the point of view of the Schlachter, why would you want to spend lots of money on a permanent army when we have, you know, as a parliamentary system, it does remarkably better. The army that they put in the field at Chotin in 1621 is far bigger than any field army fielded by, you know, the Spanish monarchy. The Battle of Rocroi, there's 20,000 on each side. That's the Spanish monarchy. Breitenfeld is the biggest battle of the 30 Years' War. There's probably 37,000 on each side. There's 55,000 at Chotin. I think this is a system that could have survived. It was a great vision, and that's what Kyiv is holding them to account for in the 1640s. And the Cossacks, that's why the Cossacks develop their separate vision, because they are excluded. And it's that is the big failure of the Commonwealth. That's what I would say, and I would agree with you absolutely on that point, Frank. They exclude a class that elsewhere in the Republic would have been seen as Schlachter. But that is not necessarily entirely the fault of Poles, I would say, as I said earlier on. But I will stop there.
And if there is, okay, I will just.
Jeśli można jeszcze odpowiedzi na to, co pan profesor przed chwilą powiedział, to trzeba tylko pamiętać, że włączenie kozaków wymagało demokratycznej zgody szlachty wyrażonej na sejmikach i sejmie. I to nie tylko polskiej szlachty, ale też litewskiej. I to, że do tego nie doszło, to nie doszło, ponieważ takiej zgody nie było. I to jest problem. I to nawet w części elit tej szlachty ruskiej, zamożniejszych. To jest jedno, czyli ja cały czas zastanawiam się, im dłużej się zajmuję Rzecząpospolitą i porównując z państwami, które ostatecznie w tym czasie w Europie zwyciężyły, czyli tymi państwami, które budowały państwa nowożytne w oparciu o wojsko i fiskalizm, to czego w Rzeczypospolitej strasznie nie chciano robić. Jak się czyta sejmiki, niezależnie od tego, w jakiej części Rzeczypospolitej, to żaden z tych sejmików, poza okresami rzeczywiście, tak jak było wspomniane, sejmikami ziem ukrainnych, które musiały bronić się przed Tatarami, czy w czasach wojennych, tak? Bardzo szybko po zakończeniu wojny większość sejmików domagała się likwidacji armii. I to było naturalne, że nie chciano ponosić tych kosztów, nie chciano budować struktur państwa stałych, centralnych. Nie chciano tego robić, chciano budować lokalne. Wiemy, że budowanie lokalnych struktur bez struktur centralnych nie przyniesie efektów w zderzeniu z państwami scentralizowanymi. To jest taka dyskusja, więc pytanie dlatego ja sobie pozwalam na powiedzenie, że ten projekt Rzeczypospolitej był trudny do zrealizowania w tym czasie, w tej przestrzeni w Europie, w zderzeniu z tym, z czym trzeba było się zderzyć w tym czasie. Tak? W XVIII wieku to było widać już gołym okiem. Tak? W XVII wieku może nie.
But what I would say is that you're reading it backwards. The fiscal military state is a creation of the second half of the 17th century, not the first half. They're fighting Sweden in the 1620s, and Gustav Adolf has not yet gone into Germany and become. Sweden is only a great power briefly because of what it can do in Germany. England is a complete failure as a military state until the new model army. France is a disaster when it goes into the 30 Years' War. The Schlachter don't see it as necessary. They have just defended their republic. They've defended it against the Ottomans. They've defended it against the Muscovites. They've defended it against the Swedes. Where's the need for a standing army? And they're defending their republic, which is not a state. It is a community of citizens. There are two states. Anyway, that's a different discussion, so I'll stop there. We got off Zenon's wonderful book. So.
Teresa?
Let me please say something in 2 words in Polish, okay? Boję się, że dyskusja zeszła trochę na inne tory, aniżeli, że tak powiem, esencja książki Zenona Kochuta, któremu się kłaniamy, życzymy zdrowia oczywiście. Mówimy o przyczynach upadku programu Rzeczpospolitej obojga, trojga, dziesięciorga, wielu narodów. No jedną z tych przyczyn jest ogromnie dużo, ale ja bym upatrywała główną przyczynę w niedocenieniu poziomu intelektualnego elity kozackiej przez szlachtę polską. Napisaliśmy kiedyś z moim uczniem taki artykuł, Kolejny stan Rzeczpospolitej. Przyczyn było wiele, przyczyny religijne, bardzo poważne. Gdyby powstał patriarchat kijowski, bądź w Zamościu, bądź w Wilnie, to nie są nasze projekty współczesnych historyków, tylko tamte projekty, to mogłoby to uchronić Rzeczpospolitą i Ukrainę od moskiewskiej tyranii. Ale to są tematy rzeka, tak? Ja jeszcze raz chcę powiedzieć, że no niesłychanym zainteresowaniem przeczytałam książkę profesora Kochuta. Przede wszystkim, jeżeli chodzi o tę drugą połowę XVII wieku, to ta część, która podpadła pod Rosję, to jest w Polsce bardzo mało znana. A szukałam tego Horlenki na przykład, tak, w polskiej literaturze, tak, który walczył z Polakami, tylko nie mogłam znaleźć. No, dziękuję bardzo.
So I think we have come to the end of our discussion of the book. Before many of you is still the lectura. So I hope we will try and find ways for those who are having problems getting to the book, perhaps to find ways to get to it. Please get in touch with me about it. And what I would say, just in concluding, it also shows, I think, an interesting historiographic trend. I go back to Professor Butterwick's lecture now. Both Professor Kohut and I are, after all, products of what might be called the silo of the Ukrainian diaspora. We were educated, in my case, born in North America. We had to face specialists in Russian history when Zenin proposed his topic on the abolition of the hetmanate over 50 years. It was viewed at the University of Pennsylvania as too narrow a topic, and they tried to dissuade him from writing it. The other thing I will point out is, in contrast to what a number of our colleagues from Ukraine have said, and the current discussions in Ukraine, we were force-fed the Shlachta by Hetmanshi. After all, our professors were Omelyan Pritsak, Ivan Lishak Rudnitsky, monarchists and followers of the Hetmanate movement. Zenin first worked on his first project was at the Lipinski Institute in Philadelphia. So in a certain way, we came from a very different perspective. And in many ways, our revolt was to show that Cossack history is worthwhile to our professors who were more interested in the nobles. Now we can meet colleagues in Ukraine who are doing the absolute opposite, reverse. And I think all of that becomes productive. The problem was we were kept apart for so many decades, and that we have to now put back together in these awful times. And we can only be grateful to the colleagues in Ukraine who keep this work in the time of war, and to Zenin, who has overcome great difficulties and produced this volume. So I wish you all a successful conference, and I will convey your best wishes to him.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank. Thank you, all panelists and all participants of this discussion. We stop here, but we proceed with our conference. Today, in 15 minutes, we will have two parallel panels, one on historiography, another on travelogues. So you are very much welcome to join these panels tonight. And tomorrow we have the full day program with many panels, another keynote lecture by Professor Frank Sissin. So stay with us, and I wish everybody fruitful and productive discussions, and see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you on next panels.
And I thank all the participants. Thank you for taking part.
Thank you.